All Things Bike with Fred Thomas is brought to you by Frame and Wheel, eBay selling services for cyclists and bike shops throughout New England, and AD Bikes, the modern face of Austro-Daimler cycling and the bike company of the future.
Hi there everybody, I'm Fred Thomas and you are watching All Things Bike, brought to you by AD Bikes and Frame and Wheel. We are speaking with Dr. Craig Brett, cyclist and cardiologist at Mercy Hospital in Portland, Maine. Craig,
thanks, Fred.
Welcome to All Things Bike.
Good to be on the show. Thank you.
Thanks for coming down. It's a beautiful day. Have you been able to ride today or this weekend? Or?
Well, I have been commuting by bike mostly this week, although today I had the motorized version out.
All right. Well, at least you're out there and you're riding a bike occasionally. Now, when you ride, are you thinking about your heart, or are you thinking of other people's hearts, or I mean, do you frequently think of your heart's performance when you're riding your bike?
You know, I can't say that I am. I'm usually more concerned with the guy in front of me and the traffic around me and staying upright. Yeah. But sometimes when I'm really suffering, I do think about what my heart's doing. Right. And the fact that it's, pumping maybe 20 liters of blood a minute, and it feels like it.
I mean, and should we be thinking about it? I mean, there's a lot of concern generally about whether cyclists are overdoing it or pushing too hard, and is this something that really should be in the back of our mind? And
I think there's a couple issues with that. The first is, some people can be incredibly fit, be great cyclists, and yet have some medical issues they may not know about. There's some genetic cholesterol abnormalities that they might have that predispose them to problems with their heart. There's some genetic heart muscle disorders that can predispose them to have heart rhythm abnormalities and have bad things happen to them when they're exercising. And a lot of times people don't know they have these things. And so that's one issue, is knowing whether or not you have something that predisposes you to something bad happening while you're exercising. And it's, I tell people they really should know their numbers. They should know what their cholesterol is and make sure they don't have one of these genetic abnormalities. We tend to think of cholesterol as a problem people who are overweight and sedentary have, but there's plenty of situations where, perfectly healthy, lean, fit people can have sky-high cholesterol that puts them at risk. So you have to know what your numbers are. You have to know your cholesterol. You have to know what your blood pressure runs. You have to know that your blood sugar isn't elevated. And if you don't have those problems and you don't have signs of these genetic heart and muscle disorders, then we don't need to worry about hurting ourselves by cycling vigorously. Right.
Well, that's good to know. I mean, does that mean that we should all ask for an EKG or an echocardiogram? Is that the thing? I mean, because you start testing and you're going to find out, well, his heart is full of joy, or he has a wooden heart, or he's a heart of stone, right? You're going to find all sorts of things that may not be relevant. I don't know.
There's some basic testing that everybody should have, whether they're a cyclist or not. The blood chemistry thing, the cholesterol numbers. In terms of screening for some of these less common genetic abnormalities that can cause high-profile sudden deaths in young athletes, those we usually reserve that for people who have a family history of a bad outcome like that. Right. If you're seeing a doctor on a regular basis, it usually can be picked up by a physical exam. Right. There's a little controversy about whether all competitive athletes should have screening EKGs, which often show this abnormality. We don't tend to do that in this country, although we're a bit of an outlier that way. In other countries, that's routine. If you're playing sports, you get an EKG looking for this, one in kind of 100,000 abnormality that can lead to sudden death with exertion. So
maybe the more practical thing is to be aware of symptoms. So I mean, you read in these articles, which the researching for the show was sort of alarming, because we're also used to reading or seeing articles saying cycling's great for you, it's going to be great, healthy and all this, but increasingly the cardiac issues, and they can be pretty frightening because, I mean, I think for me anyway, it's because I know so little about it. But the symptoms, you know, what tightness, shorter breath.
Sure.
But I mean,
sure. So if someone has symptoms, and the symptoms that should generate concern, you know, as cyclists, we're all used to being short of breath.
Always short of breath.
We're all used to being
Exactly.
short. That's not a very helpful symptom.
Always tired. Yeah.
Right.
Not quite always.
Right. But symptoms that are not normal with cycling would be a chest pressure, usually felt in the center, sometimes coming up into the shoulder, neck, or jaw.
Right.
Tightness, pressure with exertion backs off when you stop. That's not right. You're having something like that. That definitely needs attention, because that is a symptom of one of these other abnormalities that can lead to problems during exercise.
Right, right. And it's noticeable. I mean, is it? I mean, you say sort of pressure. Is it like having your 9-year-old daughter sitting on your chest, you know, or you know, pain that is equivalent to being hit with a bat or something? I mean,
people are often surprised at how it's not that severe. They
right.
assume, you know, coronary problems, which is what causes these things, is going to be the worst pain they've ever had. And it can often be not that bad, particularly somebody who's used to feeling pain.
Right.
Sure. But the fact that it's reproducible with exertion, tightness like that, that's not right. So that you get checked out. And a lot of times it's not the heart. There's other things that can do that. Mm-hmm. But a symptom like that should be looked into.
Yeah, well, that's good to know. Well, the heart is a complicated, it's a muscle, but it's a pretty complicated one. And it's got an electrical aspect to it and a mechanical aspect to it, and I mean, in general terms, any way you prefer to, can you sort of shed some perspective on that?
It is an amazing machine, and the electrical aspects of how the heart rhythm is generated is one part that often goes awry. And interestingly, very vigorous athletics and competitive athletes are particularly prone to one type of electrical rhythm abnormality of the heart called atrial fibrillation.
Oh yeah,
and
AFib, we've heard of
AFib,
yeah.
right, yeah. AFib. And so that's probably the most common heart rhythm abnormality that cyclists might be exposed to or have. What AFib is a loss in the normal synchrony between the top chambers of the heart and bottom chambers. Normally blood goes to the top, that fills up, pumps down to the bottom. Bottom chamber then is primed with that and contracts and gives you a heartbeat. Top, bottom, top, bottom.
I see.
When you go into atrial fibrillation, you lose that nice synchrony, and the top just quivers or vibrates. The bottom chamber, which is what gives you the heartbeat, is trying to follow it, and so it goes fast, it goes irregular, and it's not getting primed. So you lose a lot of efficiency.
Right.
And with that top chamber just quivering like that, blood can get stagnant and clot, and so we worry about clots traveling and causing bad things.
Right.
And very extreme exertion for prolonged periods of time, you know, things like what you do, less so me these days, seems to have, there seems to be some association with that in atrial fibrillation. So the symptoms of that are a heart rate that doesn't come down after you stop.
Right, and I've heard that. Yeah, I mean,
it just stays up.
Whatever your elevated heart rate might be is
exactly.
You're sitting, but your heart rate's still going as if you're riding up a hill or something.
Exactly, and usually irregular too is the other hallmark of that. Yeah. So that's a symptom that if somebody had should seek attention for.
Right, and how does that differ from a mechanical related abnormality or condition?
Yeah, the mechanics of the heart. So the heart at rest can pump 5 or 6 liters per minute of blood, basically our blood volume in a minute. A recreational cyclist can increase that up 20, maybe 20 liters per minute. You can probably do twice that, 40 liters per minute. I wouldn't be surprised.
I don't want to know.
And so, you know, tremendous ability to change how much pumping it can do.
The volume.
The volume.
Yeah, right.
And so there are ways it does that over time. People who are trained and fit, they'll have some dilation of the chamber, the pumping chamber of the heart, so they can get more of a volume with each stroke. Right. And that really allows, with a faster heart rate, to get a lot of blood moving.
All right, so the heart is enlarged, I suppose.
So technically, very extreme athletes will have some enlargement of the heart. And that causes trouble for a cardiologist because
Yeah.
that can be a normal finding in athletic heart, but that pattern has some overlap with an abnormal finding that other disease states can cause.
Right.
So we spend some time often trying to figure that out, and there's ways to do that. But,
Right.
But the dilation, the enlargement of the heart in the athlete is not a disease state. That's a normal adaptation.
Right. And yeah, but and that leads to another adaptation that we read about, which is the low resting heart rate. And so I mean, I went to the doctor recently, and she took my pulse and said it was 50 or something. I thought it was wrong, but it seems really low. I mean, I thought she thought I was a vampire or something. And she's going to get the steak and all this. But can it be too low? I mean,
So low resting heart rate in general means that you're fit, and it's a reflection of the fact that you have a bigger stroke volume with each, so you don't need to go 70 like the rest of us. You can go 50 at rest. There are some exceptions to this, though.
Seems really low, though.
And there are some disease states where the pacemaker of the heart's not working well, and the heart can be inappropriately low. The key differential is if your heart rate is low at rest, but you can get it to go up when it needs to, when you exert, then we don't worry about that low heart rate.
Right. Wow. And
there are people, there are people who have fit athletes who have resting heart rates in the high 30s.
Yikes. Well, that definitely sounds borderline vampire, or approaching it. Well, are there any other adaptations that are worth noting, you think?
So the enlargement, the slow heart rate, and oftentimes we'll see, particularly in cyclists, we'll see a little more thickness in the heart muscle walls. And again, so as a cardiologist, that can be confusing because that has some overlap with a different heart problem that causes heart muscle thickening.
Yeah.
In the athlete, that thickening is a normal adaptation.
Right. It's myocardial fibrosis is a term that I'm not sure if that's the correct one, but that sounds that's a surprise to hear that the heart can thicken and become stiff and scarred and yeah, it's confusing. So it's not always you're not scarring your heart by exercising, right?
Right. So the vast majority of the time when we see that thickness in an athlete, that's a normal adaptation.
Right.
Does not actually make the heart stiff,
Right.
unlike the disease state that can make it stiff.
Yeah.
However, there has been some recent science looking at very prolonged, very vigorous exertion, that there may actually, people are really pushing it a long period of time, can get some fibrotic or scarring changes in their heart. And you can actually measure this with a blood test called a troponin. And so it's led to some controversy of whether you're doing harm when you're doing a long, very vigorous long-term exertion.
Yeah, like race across America. I mean,
Right.
Those guys,
Right.
they don't even, I don't know, they ride 12 hours and sleep for 6.
Right. Right.
Well, I mean,
but the data is inconclusive, and there's
Right.
some conflict. There's some conflict in that infrared. So I think the key thing is not to project the message that exercise is bad.
Yeah, exactly.
Or that vigorous, competitive exercise is bad. It's very clear that compared to being sedentary, there's no question that it's that's a heart healthy activity.
Yeah.
At the very high levels, long periods of time, that's where there's some controversy.
Right. And well, how about best practice for keeping your heart healthy? I mean, I guess.
So the American Heart Association has some guidelines.
Right.
They recommend 30 minutes of kind of moderately vigorous activity. That might be where you get your heart rate up to 50 or 60% of its maximum. Fairly moderate levels of exertion. And so that's the guideline
Right.
for the American Heart Association. I think for somebody who's doing quite a bit more than that, I think I would be aware of this signal that may be really long-term extreme exercise. You're probably not helping yourself. I don't know how much you're really hurting yourself, but that's not helping you. That's
true, and I suppose that's more relevant when you're above age 40 or 50. I mean, it's true. There are more masters category cyclists out there, and the human body maybe wasn't really designed to be, riding 120 20 miles.
I think that's exactly right, and I think, you know, particularly where these signals have been seen of some fibrosis, that has been typically more in the older athlete.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's right. I mean, I think it is, the message is getting out there, but nutrition is another part of it too. What are some best practices there?
I think, you know, again, that's where it gets a little bit back to kind of knowing what your numbers are.
I see.
And I think, you know, people, when you're consuming large amounts of calories with what you're doing as an activity each day, how you replenish those calories, I think how those calories come to you, the importance of that really depends on what your background metabolism is. So people who have some tendency for elevated cholesterol, some tendency for elevated blood sugar, they're going to need to watch how they replenish those calories.
Right. It is, and that's, I think, one of the difficult things to reconcile is the athlete thinks, hey, I'm healthy, I can eat anything I like, but cholesterol is still cholesterol, I suppose, and even if you are fit, you can have that those problems. How about rest? I mean, that's another sort of, it's a difficult thing for a lot of athletes to do. They want to hit their numbers, they want to ride, they want to make their hours and be ready, but rest is a big part of it too.
And you know, just in terms of specifically speaking about the heart, we know in other situations where the heart has had some insult to it, say someone who's had a coronary event or someone who's had heart surgery, some insult to the heart, we know it's very clear the heart does better when it has a period of rest after that. So I think you can extrapolate that to when you're pushing yourself hard and you know, in a competitive environment, that you know, rest after is probably important.
Yeah, and the heart just recovers like your leg muscle.
Like a leg muscle, yeah. A very different muscle when you look at it, but I think that analogy is the same.
Right. Well, but just briefly, in broadest terms, is genetics a topic that you find yourself talking about frequently when it comes to the heart? Or
I see. Yes, I think, you know, a lot of what we deal with as cardiologists are genetic abnormalities, and it can be very frustrating for a guy, you know, like you, comes in, he's fit, he's eating right, he's, you know, loves what he does, wants to ride hard, and has one of these genetic abnormalities of either high cholesterol, which predisposes to plaque buildup in the heart arteries, or one of these genetic, we call them cardiomyopathies, where the heart muscle is just not structured right, and at high levels of exercise can cause trouble. And that can be really frustrating for people like that, because these are not, you know, it's not a lifestyle problem that's given them this abnormality. It's
it's
you know,
frustrating.
we're slaves to our genetics, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, it's certainly important to know whether you have that. Sometimes you can get that just from your family history. You know, if you had a father who passed away suddenly at age 45, you got to know what happened, and you got to get checked and find out what, you know, whether you inherited that abnormality or not. But there are some of these abnormalities are inherited in a recessive manner, so a parent might not have it. It might be a couple of generations removed. Those are harder.
Yeah, right. Well, are there any cases or anecdotes that you can refer to that stick out in your mind that would be worth mentioning?
I do have one. Of course, I won't mention his name, but it was a good friend who I ride with quite a bit, who several years back was having a hard time keeping up with the group, and you know, he's in his 40s, maybe his early 50s then, I can't remember, but we were kind of making fun of him and giving him a hard time. You know, you got to get out there more. And he eventually showed up at my office and said, I think there's something wrong. I can't, you know, I can't do it. And we put him through the testing, and he had a terrible high-grade blockage in one of the main arteries that fed the heart. You know, so he knew something was wrong, and he didn't have the chest pain, pressure, tightness that would have been a more clear signal. He just, something wasn't right. He couldn't keep up with the group when he thought he should have been able to. Unfortunately, he got that fixed, and you know, he's riding in the front again. But I think your body often tells you things that we sometimes like to ignore and move on. And
but at least he was comfortable enough to sort of come to terms with it and do something about it and put his hands up and find out. I mean, that sounds like it's one of the most important things. You know, tune up your bike
Right.
And go to the doctor. And well, that's really interesting stuff, Craig. Thanks for talking to us about all this.
My pleasure, Brett. Thanks for having me on the show.
That was Craig Brett, cyclist and cardiologist at Mercy Hospital. You can learn more about this topic at the American Heart Association and the Mercy Hospital website. That's all we have for today. We'll see you soon.